This is the Solution Talk. Sustaining academic freedom, sustaining the future. Please welcome your host from the University of Auckland, Dawn Freshwater.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just checking that you can hear from the floor here. It's great to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Now, a very interesting session ahead of us this afternoon. For many people, they haven't quite made the connection between academic freedom, the evidence base that comes out of research, development, universities and science, and the link to science-based sustainability. But there is a very strong link, and we're going to explore that this afternoon through our panelists. Now, I'm not going to spend time introducing our panelists. I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves. Can I just note that we're very fortunate to be here this afternoon. Actually, we're very well supported by the German Commission for UNESCO through the Michael Otto Foundation for Sustainability and the University of Hamburg, as well as Volkswagen's different. So thank you very much for supporting what is actually quite an inspirational connection to think about academic freedom in the context of sustainability science, and the SDGs. So this is the focus for this afternoon. As you introduce yourselves this afternoon, panelists, I'm going to let you do that. I'm going to come to you first, Michael. Could you also perhaps get us started, get the juices flowing by saying a few words around, what's at stake for society if academic freedom is undermined?
Look, first, thank you for having me. Thank you to the Otto Foundation and the supporters of this panel for putting this together. I think it's a great idea to see whether there's sufficient interest at a conference on sustainability on the freedom of speech and academic freedom issues. I've spent the last 25 years of my life in the United States, in Washington, so take what I will be saying with a grain of salt, because I think we are seeing in real time what happens when universities, freedom of speech, academic freedoms are being attacked by a government wholesale at every level. And I feel that this is pertinent to the issue of sustainability, because the transformation that we need to make in our Western societies in the coming generation is nothing short of historic. And societies can only self-correct if they have the capacity of reflection and self-critique, and this is what universities do. So I think universities will have to play a key role in the next decade or two. What we're seeing right now in the United States is we're going backwards with a velocity that has astonished me. With the attack of the government on US educational institutions, the reactions by and large that we have seen were opportunistic behavior by university presidents and boards, were preemptive kowtowing before the administration, and it is self-censorship to a degree that I would never have thought possible. And I feel that if we do not turn the curve on what is happening in the United States, and I would say the chances are 50-50, because after the first Ivy League schools, Columbia University being example A, with rewriting their Middle East curriculum and basically agreeing to all the outrageous standards that the task force of the White House had established, caused a cascading effect among other Ivy League and other schools. And as far as I can tell, there is a complacency and even a willingness to take away master's degrees from university students because they have participated in pro-Palestinian protests. So things are happening at a speed that is astonishing. The depth of the transformation is considerable. And the fact that the government uses government funding as a tool and lever of extortion is nothing short of dramatic. And I feel that after the experiences of the last 16 months in the United States, took Erdogan in Turkey a decade to achieve the same compliance that we have achieved within a year and a half. We need a radical reset and a radical reassessment of how we run and how we govern and how we establish and finance universities.
So Michael is a keen observer of political polarization and democracy. We're going to come back to that we are going to really pull the theme of sustainability through this as well, and the impact of such things, of political polarization on moving through sustainability science to achieve those outcomes. Thank you, Michael. Anna.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for putting this great panel together. Well, I mean, I'm a sociologist by training, and coming from that perspective, functional differentiation of society is crucial to any type of society that puts in checks and balances in many ways, you could argue, and aims for inclusive but also subject-oriented, again and again subject-oriented governance. Functional differentiation in the sense of keeping a science system apart from a political system. And then, of course, putting organizations in between that we might call boundary organizations, such as science policy interfaces and scientific advisory landscapes, that then have the job of bridging these two logics of science and policymaking. And when we talk academic freedom and why that is necessary, of course, it is indeed about having these checks and balances in place and ensuring that independent thought and knowledge production, but also the socialization of young minds into critical thinking and into the ability to form their own perspectives and to formulate their own thoughts clearly is crucial. It's in the end, it is a form of democracy protection that is very much needed, and I think some of your examples underline that already.
Thanks, Anna. Tshilidzi, a different perspective from you. Perhaps you could introduce yourself as you do that.
No, thank you very much for Mr. Otto for helping us to participate in this very important issue. I am Tshilidzi Marwala. I used to be the president of University of Johannesburg. Now I'm the head of the United Nations University. And the topic that you have is very relevant to me because just a few weeks ago, we were given money by an entity to develop a free AI course. I'm an AI engineer. And it cost about $500,000. And it was developed, the actors were there, I was one of the lecturers. And just on the eve of launching it, I get a call and somebody said, maybe we should put a break on this program. Why? Because you are using quite divisive words. English is not my first language. It's not even my second language. It's not even my third language. I said, what have I missed? Which are the words? Are we using swear words in this lecture? They said, no. You are using the word climate change, and you are using the word, the words sustainable development. That's just a visual illustration of what quite powerful forces. And this is very important that in many ways, when we want to assure ourselves academic freedom, we always have to negotiate with quite powerful forces with vast amounts of powers, and they could actually be able to stop projects if they don't like them. And of course, when somebody stops funding a project, it might not look like they are undermining academic freedom. But the problem is that you create a culture that incentivizes listening to the funder as being more important than listening to what the facts are actually telling you. And what worries me is that if we go at this trajectory, the knowledge system that is going to emerge out of that will actually be distorted. It will have been the knowledge that was created with a full realization that there is a big man or the big woman who is looking, and if they are displeased, they can take quite drastic steps.
So you've moved us into a slightly different space, which is also around knowledge generation and where knowledge is generated, who has the power to support knowledge generation. There are issues around misinformation, disinformation. There's all sorts of concerns around motivations for those types of knowledge that are generated. And that brings us back to thinking about the role that we have in supporting an evidence base to support a science-based approach to decision making and policy. But I was listening to your responses and I was sitting here from the Pacific thinking, these responses and the conversation that we're having here, how is that going to change the fact that some of the Pacific islands are soon going to be digital islands? Because they will all be underwater and they'll have to move away from those islands. How is that solving the pandemic of measles in New Zealand? So I think we have a job to make that link and to help that become something that is really understood by the population, because nobody's jumping in front of us all and saying, we want to protect the university, we want to protect science, so we've got a trust issue. And we've talked about the challenge, but in understanding the challenge, and some of those challenges came up this morning at a fantastic session that we had around political influence, and you talked, Michael, about self-censorship, and then we talked a bit about how do we go forward, because this is a solution talk. So I'm really going to press you here. We can talk about the challenge. We're very good at narrating the challenge. But in understanding that challenge, let's think about the developments that we can take and how we go forward. And Michael, you've talked about democratic developments.
Yes.
And you obviously think a lot about these in the context of academic institutions, the challenges to scholars. What are the developments that concern you, and what are the proposed solutions?
So I don't really have a good response, and you can feel that this kind of slightly depressive atmosphere that I'm emanating here is really informed by the experience of the United States in the last year and a half. I think university at the end will have no chance but to get involved in political discussions. I think the separation of science and politics is not going to hold. And it should not hold because universities, to the degree that they have been co-opted by the government in the United States, need to make hard choices as to whether they want to be part of the counter-enlightenment or part of the Enlightenment. I think in the public arena, this is even more complicated. We have in the United States only 20% of the conservative voters feel that universities do more good than bad. A fifth, which means you don't even want to think about the other 80%. These are mostly prosperous white middle classes that are people that have an education, they can read and write, they go to church once a month, and they often live in affluent suburban areas. I feel that those people have encapsulated themselves in a narrative that is almost entirely detached from social reality in our country and has become impermeable. Because what Donald Trump is addressing and the authoritarian impulses that he has set free in his administration addresses immaterial needs of materially secure middle classes. But they will never admit that the public cruelty of the government, that the fact that now you have to deny climate change and say the last election was stolen to become a member of the Republican Party that is respected internally, people will never admit that they are living a life of lies. So the rationalizations are we're paying for your taxes and there's so much crime and what have you. But it is almost impossible to reach those groups through rational narrative. And then you have basically two options. You can buy into the counter-populism narrative, and some Democratic politicians are doing that. I think that's dangerous. And as a liberal, you will probably not win that battle. Or you have to say there are clear-cut boundaries. If people say that climate change does not exist, even after you present all the evidence, then they cannot be part of the conversation. And that's what I mean by universities have to make hard political decisions and reconfigure and restructure the way they're governed establish normative defensive walls, and rethink, in the case of the United States, the entire financial structure from the ground up, because all the external financial influences are poison to independent thought and academic freedom. So I feel there's a certain conundrum that needs to come to a pivot point where universities have to make hard choices. And then if there are enough universities that make those choices, we might have a chance. Otherwise, I'm very pessimistic.
And interestingly, on the slide that we just had, right at the center was critical thinking. And you've left me thinking about where critical thinking begins, but at the same time, perhaps people are not necessarily not thinking critically, they're just making choices from a pragmatic point of view when you talk about the decisions that people are making. I think this is a really difficult space to navigate, and I wonder, Tshilidzi, if this is different across different geographical boundaries. Does it take different forms in different countries and across different continents?
No, I mean, look, I wouldn't even go to the point of critical thinking, because academic freedom, the mistake that we have made was to think academic freedom starts at the academic institutions.
Exactly.
I think it starts with the people, because I'm glad you talk about United States, because I was an undergraduate student when the mobilization of what we see today was happening.
Mm-hmm.
The popular radio, I can even name people, Rush Limbaugh, almost started at the time when I was an undergraduate. And academics don't seem to be able to connect to the people. And the people are the ones who are actually going to go and vote. And when they vote, the government, in many ways, is going to reflect many of the things that they believe, but it will also neglect things that they don't care about. So we need to go back to the people. It's not going to be an easy journey. There is no shortcut. It's not going to be an easy journey. It will mean we make it our mission, certainly as educators, the responsibility of planting the culture of learning, the culture of looking at data, the culture of critical thinking into our communities. And we don't just have to go to schools. We have to go to community centers. We have to go to places of religious thinking, religious gatherings. Science must be discussed there. And certainly, I'm also I grew up in an environment where debates even came to places of worship. And this is not going to be easy. We have to get into the popular media, and simplify what we do. And then just one last thing. There's always a disconnect in what is happening in the labs, especially in the higher sciences. I have asked top scientists, have you taken what you are doing, beautiful things you are doing in the lab, to your local community? No, they haven't. How are the people, certainly in democracy, going to support something that they do not understand?
The importance of social impact and understanding that social impact and be able to talk to it. But the other thing that you spoke about actually was also where we have to start thinking about engaging young people in reading in order to know what they think and to be able to understand where other people's thinking is coming from. Anna, this science policy connection is one of the things that you're really focused on. And I know that from a particular discipline, you've looked at that. But when you listen to our other panelists, what's your thinking and where's your proposed solution going to come from?
Thank you. I mean, listening to you, I have to sort of just ponder up and what you're talking about is, I mean, obviously critical thinking doesn't start and end at a university, but it's in the end it is about the knowledge culture in an overall society. Do we live in a society where critical speech is exercised, where children also in their families and homes are challenged to debate, and to employ the sharpness of their mind in order to think about future, think about present, engage into political debates, which are not necessarily party political, yeah, but usually everyday political, but to sharpen their minds and their own thinking. Nevertheless, you also asked after Dawn, after sea level rise, and how does all of that have anything to do with small island development states in the Pacific? And I just want to say, I mean, we are not. I'm heading a research institute and think tank here in Germany, and we are not quite in the situation yet as you describe it in the US. And we're in a context where I would say, well, I mean, what research is, it's either empirical research or it's theory-led research, and then there's sort of a lot in between, but it has a substance. And it's basically, the substance is either through modeling approaches or through the empiricism itself. And that is not going away by us simply sort of ignoring the facts or the laws of physics, yeah, because you spoke of climate change. I mean, these laws of physics don't change, and the empirical context of relative sea level rise also does not change by the G7, for instance, now deciding, the environmental ministers just decided recently not to speak of climate change this year, but to speak of insurance-related effects of extreme weather events. Now, of course, that relates to climate change, but the term climate change was not used. Now, out of my perspective, well, terms do matter, and they matter a lot. You could say us at the moment not speaking, or the G7 not speaking of climate change, but rather of insurance-related effects of extreme weather events, leads to sort of a further differentiation of the climate change debate. It leads us or pushes us to unpack the box. That's a positive interpretation. But it also means that we don't name climate change as what it is, climate change. But that does, of course, not make the laws of physics go away or the empirical context go away, that indeed we have relative sea level change, not just in the Pacific, but everywhere. We have heat waves in Europe, and they will continue. So I'm not sure whether it really answers your question on how this relates to sea level rise or to the big sustainable development concerns that we are facing. But in the end, of course, it is about doing solid, methodologically speaking, solid empirical or theory-led research, and then carrying that understanding that we detract from that into decision-making spaces. So.
Thanks, Anna. I think you've both pointed out the importance of language. And I wonder if our climate migrants and the climate justice and the injustice that's happening, those people who are living that reality really talk about insurance. Probably not. Or they might think about it, but not in the same way. What you've also referred to, in a sense, is this disconnect. You know, how do we talk about the work that we do in the context of sustainability and social impact? And I was listening to you thinking about the WEF risk report of 2026, which talks about the relationship to all of these things to the economy. One of the solutions, in fact, many of the solutions involve universities and research, and importantly, thinking about how science will move through that. So talking about it in relation to the economy is also an important way of building the connections to politicians and policy. And I think this comes back to you, Michael, in what you were saying. You know, we're in the middle of poly-crisis, it seems. You know, should we be advocating for the sustainability goals right now?
Of course. I mean, the reality is the reality, but there's costs associated with that. And that's the clear US example. You will lose money if you insist in these issues. And so be it. If a university can't make that call, then it doesn't deserve the name of an institution of higher education. And I admit that thankfully you're in a different situation here in Germany, but an irony of historic proportion, the authority over education has been decentralized after the Nazi experience, and now you might have an absolute majority of the neo-fascist party in one of the eastern states will then have increasing leverage over how universities and schools are being run. So I think this is getting closer and closer. And I think universities need to think about governance, about defensive normative frameworks, about how to defend their students and their professors, of how to vet all the money that is coming in, because state funding can be weaponized on a dime. In the case of the United States, I would just start vetting the money that comes in from private donors that is often earmarked for prestigious projects. And now universities said we're losing government funding, but we can't use our $53 billion endowment because this is all earmarked. I'm completely ridiculous. Don't take money unless you put in a footnote and say, in a case of emergency of academic freedom of expression being under pressure, we will use that money for whatever we need it. And there should be an international legal framework holding governments responsible where universities can sue, because I think this is a make or break moment, because as you say, sustainability is not only an environmental but also an economic question, which means, translated, for our society in the United States with 4% of the global population and 20% of the fossil fuel use, this will have to translate in a plateauing or lowering of living standards. Mm-hmm. And that argument, if you will try to make that argument in a populistic context where facts don't matter, good luck with that. You won't succeed. Mm-hmm. So I feel that universities are a very important corrective, more so than ever, because I think we will be seeing a historic challenge over the next 15 to 20 years when it comes to adaptation, mitigation, and also kind of transforming our economic practice into ways that are more climate compliant. But I feel that this needs to be fought through politically. This is the role that universities at least partially had during apartheid in South Africa. But they're also, it's not only conservative, they're also progressive governments like in Mexico that are engaging in full-fledged attacks on prime research institutions because they are critical. So there needs to be an international dimension as well. And I feel that the problem is that we will move more towards an age of counter-enlightenment if we don't uphold those standards, which will be endlessly complicated by artificial intelligence, as we all know, because this is has the potential to be kind of dramatic. I have a friend in the US who had a girl in his oral master's exams, and she completely fell apart. Turned out she had not written one paper herself, and she was in a master degree, had got her BA and was in a master degree oral exam. So I don't know how we're going to address all of this, but I would say kind of should be a wake-up call, and the Europeans still have kind of some leeway to use the US as an early warning system for what might happen.
So this is, you've narrated quite well the poly crisis, thank you. But the reality in all of that, of course, is also that at the heart of that, there are questions around whether or not universities, academics, scientists are partisan. Because, we could be seen as political actors. Now, that's not my particular view I'm putting out there, but it is one of the issues we face when we talk about institutional neutrality and how we think about what we advocate for. And I'm interested from a policy perspective, Anna, if you think that, that if we really advocate strongly for climate change, for climate science, for climate justice, for all of the work we're doing in sustainability, does that risk undermining us in terms of our neutral position or perceived neutral position?
Well, I'm a sociologist of knowledge and of development by training. And from that perspective, let me just say, knowledge is never neutral. There is no such thing as neutral knowledge. The question is it, how do we work with that knowledge? Yeah? And it should, research and also climate research should never be, I said it already, party political, no. But it is, of course, our responsibility when we understand certain processes in our ecosystems, for instance, to then also make that known and then carry it into decision-making spaces that then will have the political discussion over how to address the for instance, climate change as a crisis or as a substantial challenge. So to me, it's not a debate about turning political. Yeah? The science system has its own logic and also its own ways of ensuring quality through its own mechanisms of peer review, etc., and that has to be trusted. Now, are we sort of close to a shift if we have shifts in government? I would argue yes, yeah, I fully agree with you. It's not that we are in a safe haven and will be in a safe haven here in the European context also in the future, but I think many of us here in the room are very carefully observing what is happening on the level of our state governments across the German context and what is happening then potentially also on the federal level or in other European contexts, fully aware of the fact that independence and independent research, or the sort of formally assigned role of conducting independent research, is actually being negotiated on a day-to-day basis by every university, by every research institute. And you negotiate it every single day in a way, yeah, by making sure that basically you live and adhere to the rules of quality assurance from the science system, engage with policy making, yes, but do not transfer the power over who defines what questions are to be asked, which kind of methodologies are being employed to pursue these questions, and how data are being analyzed. Yeah? So I think that understanding of where does actually influence creep in a way, and what does that then mean for negotiating that ability to do independent research on a day-to-day basis is crucial.
So Anna, I think you've made really important points, because people do not necessarily understand the difference between independence and neutrality. They often get conflated within our institutions. And then Michael's earlier comments about self-censorship being in institutions of reflection, deliberative, conscious institutions, really understanding when independence is being challenged, not because you can necessarily change it, but because observing where it's challenged helps you to interpret the data and the information that's used for decision better in context. It's contextual. I think these are really important points when we apply them to thinking about our science and sustainability. I want to just turn slightly towards leadership here, because I think, Tshilidzi, we have this, we can talk here about, the challenges we face, but how do we lead our way through it?
Well, this is a difficult one. But before I come to the leadership question, because I think I have a pretty good idea of what needs to be done there. Just to come on the issue of neutrality, what we are supposed to do is to teach people and give them the skills to be able to make use of information for their decisions. During the time of COVID, I had a tough time in convincing family members to go and vaccinate, And if we go back to the science itself, we are told that you have to trust the scientific method, but always doubt the results. That is why you always interrogate and say, is there something that I have missed? And so on and so forth. That is really the fundamental driver of scientific progress is doubt, and many, whether it is relativity, they came out because they were doubting what was considered gospel at the time, So that's very important, that we capacitate people to understand that we trust the process and what it gives us, but we always know that there are always degrees of uncertainties. That's why we need to support science, so that they can continue to investigate what we have missed. Now, coming to leadership, in order to solve these problems, what we need to be done? Firstly, we need to assert the values. Values in society are very, very important. Truth is one of the values. Honesty is one of the values. Protection of people, certainly for me, is one of the values. And secondly, we need to cultivate the correct behavior. And for me as an educator, when you educate people, you are actually giving them the tools to behave in a certain way. And they will behave in a certain way because they have read a book, or they've read a paper, or they have been told about the processes that leads to certain conclusions. Very, very important. And then the third issue is incentives. What are the incentives? Part of the reason why at universities you can bend sometimes the way things are done is because there is something called money, whether it is coming from the funder, whether and sometimes it's very subtle. They will tell you, your language is a little bit too sharp, especially if you're applying for this grant from this foundation, and so on and so forth, and it becomes self censorship.
Yes.
And then the fourth thing is really policies and regulations that we need to put into place. And these policies and regulations, some of them are best practices, some of them are hard policies that we put into place, and then institutions that are going to help us to be able to create this culture that we want. Schools are some of the institutions, social organizations are some of the institutions, televisions, entertainment in many ways can also be used to be able to advance this. Yeah.
Can I just jump in on one point? Because I think about this a lot. I think my feeling is the notion of Cartesian doubt as the foundational experience for critical individuality or critical subjectivity, that has a certain point in history when there was a Christian order that informed the world and there was a shared perception of religious or secular reality. Right now, what I see in the United States is a level of digital mass manipulation that has parcelized our society, that there is no shared public sphere or public arena any longer to which you can refer. So the doubt for many of, especially on the conservative end of the spectrum that think universities do damage, the doubt has become independent of any creation of critical subjectivity. It is kind of a hollow doubt. As Adorno said, we all enter the world as originals and we leave the world as copies. And I think I always thought that was just a bon mot in Minima Moralia. Right now, I think with a 60-year delay, he was right on target looking at many of my fellow American.
But education must allow us to have informed doubt.
Absolutely.
Informed doubt.
Emphasis on the informed part. So I completely agree, but I feel that this makes it so difficult to come up with solutions and leadership, because I think the leadership right now is resistance against that form of digital mass manipulation and resilience when it comes to defending informed doubt, as you point out so eloquently.
Well, to go back to the sort of notion of skepticism and skeptikos, and thinking about how we really, for us, we can have that skepticism in this room, we can hold it. But what we really need is for that to be societal. And we go back to education, we go back to research and think about our role in how we genuinely support those sorts of skills being developed within the walls of our institutions. And maybe we've got some work to do on that. Maybe we have some work to do in schools. Maybe we have some work to do in our communities, because without an understanding of what it is that academic freedom being undermined will do, we are not going to have people standing up and supporting and defending those sorts of things that we hold so dear. We are under pressure, academic freedom under pressure. It's a conversation we had this morning. It's putting sustainability at risk. So as we draw to some conclusions in our panel, I'm going to ask each panelist in this context, if you could change one thing tomorrow to strengthen academic freedom and how it contributes to sustainable development, what would it be? Anna?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I want to say two things. First, I want to say that, the large part of globally speaking, of science funding and how our tertiary education system, but all education systems are financed, are still national funds, 90% or so. Yeah? There's only one regional entity that significantly puts money into research, and that's the European Union. Others doing it at a much smaller scale. We don't really have a significant amount of multilateral science funding. And I think if we have to keep that in mind, and we have to realize that as long as we basically live on a sort of knowledge backbone that is largely financed through national pots of financing, there's always a risk of nationalist tendencies having an effect. That risk is simply there. So I would say, to your question, invest into regional science funding and funding of tertiary and secondary education systems, and build up significant ways of multilateral science funding. And that doesn't exist so far. It's small amounts. Yeah, it's small Belmont Forum here, Future Earth there, but they're tiny amounts. That has to be ramped up. And as part of that, and that's my second point, I think it's worth considering and worth discussing in the next 2 years or 3 years, whether something such as a science goal for a post-2030 agenda might help us with that.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think what we really need is security. We need to create societies where people are secure to express themselves. And normally when we think of security of people, we think of anti-democratic countries. I saw it when democratic people made me insecure. Some scientists in South Africa discovered an Omicron. And then I see on CNN the South African virus. And all of a sudden I was told I cannot be able to travel. I mean, what do you think it encourages? It encourages people to be fearful of just disclosing things. Because if they disclose the wrong things, even democratic countries are going to ostracize. Very, very important. And creating a culture of security even goes to the universities, because now people are afraid of whether it is government. By the way, I think the European Union is much, much more protected from a single individual waking up in the morning and denying an institution funding. I don't think it will happen. And the reason for that is because there are too many, the decision making is actually much more collective. So you are not going to have an executive order coming from the president of the European Union.
That's the strength of the European Union.
That's absolutely, and you need to take advantage of that. But the culture of safety in our spaces is very, very important, especially from sophisticated types of harm that are subtle.
Michael.
I think universities need to self-regulate in a way and take this kind of historic moment as a negative form of inspiration, maybe in a more monastic way. I would envision that universities need to put less value on the best fundraiser and the professor that gets his or her 90 seconds on national television, but find ways to evaluate professors that create critical thinking and are almost exclusively driven by the mission and by their interest in academic questions, and make sure that those are the people that have the strongest voice within the university.
Thank you. Well, fundamental to all of your comments, with your one thing that you would do, is the notion of trust. And I think, my observation would be that we have a lot of work to do in terms of rebuilding trust. And that's something we talk about, what's happening outside of the walls of our institution, but it's a reflection back to us. And, there is something of a work that we need to do perhaps together, which is why it's been wonderful to have the opportunity to come together at this sustainability conference in Hamburg, and to have the opportunity to speak freely together about our passion and conviction around sustainability, so much so that we're willing, of course, to really put academic freedom under scrutiny and to defend it fiercely. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for everybody for being here as part of this event, and thank you to those that have supported it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.